I never thought that in the last stretch of my life, when a man should be allowed to rest in the dignity he has earned, I would find myself writing these words not in gratitude for the life I built, but as a kind of testimony, a record of humiliation, a quiet protest against the cruelty that was dealt to me by the very people I once considered my only family. My name is Leonard Harlow. I am 76 years old, and I live, or rather I lived, in the house that I built with my wife more than 40 years ago. Every corner of that place was touched by our hands. The heavy oak beams I sanded myself in the garage when I was still strong. The rose bushes she planted along the fence because she wanted the street to look alive in the spring. The kitchen table, where our daughter used to do her homework while we cooked side by side. That house was never just wood and plaster. It was the container of a whole life, and after my wife passed away, it became my last connection to her, the only physical reminder that we had built something together that endured. People sometimes speak lightly of houses, as if they were assets on paper or investments to trade. But to me, the house was not only shelter, it was memory, love, safety, and continuity. It was the only thing that kept me from drifting away entirely after losing her. I had worked as a teacher for most of my life, and though the salary was never extraordinary, it was steady enough that we lived without debts and managed to raise our daughter Caroline with everything she needed. My wife and I were frugal, not because we were stingy, but because we wanted our daughter to have a good education, and we wanted to have something to leave behind for her when we were gone. Caroline was our only child, the center of our attention, the reason my wife kept working long hours at the library even when her health began to falter. I remember how, when we signed the last payment for the mortgage, my wife said, half joking and half serious, "This is Caroline's inheritance, Leonard, but it is also our fortress, our place of rest, when the world outside is too much." She was right. Of course, and I never questioned it. For decades we lived there in peace, through winters when the pipes froze, and summers when the air was so heavy we slept with the windows open and listened to the cicadas. Those were the years when I believed the family was unshakable, that blood and shared memory were enough to bind people together. But when you grow old, you begin to notice how invisible you become to the younger generation, how your presence is no longer a source of comfort, but a nuisance. After my wife died from a sudden stroke 7 years ago, the silence of the house became unbearable. The first mornings were the hardest, waking up and turning to an empty side of the bed, realizing that no smell of coffee would come from the kitchen, that no voice would remind me of the errands we had planned. I started brewing coffee the way she used to, 3 spoons of ground beans, a pinch of salt, 200 milliliters of water. But it never tasted like hers, as if even the simplest ritual had lost its soul. Caroline came to the funeral, dressed impeccably, surrounded by her husband Mark, who had always seemed more concerned with careers and appearances than with warmth. She stood next to me with dry eyes and asked, as if she were inquiring about the weather, whether I had thought about moving into a smaller place. "Dad, the house is too big for you alone. It would be more practical if you let us help you manage things." At the time, I thought she was speaking out of concern, though a part of me noticed how quickly the conversation turned from grief to property, from memories of her mother to the value of bricks and land. I tried to dismiss the thought. After all, she was my daughter, and I wanted to believe she had my best interests at heart. I agreed to some of her proposals, letting her handle bills and taxes, even signing papers she brought from a lawyer, documents that she said would simplify ownership and make things easier in the future. I did not read them carefully, partly because my eyesight was no longer sharp, partly because I trusted her. She was my own flesh and blood, and what father imagines betrayal from his only child? Still, little by little, I began to feel displaced in my own home. The room that once belonged to her was converted into a guest room for her visits, but she hardly came. When she did, she brought Mark, who walked through the place like a landlord inspecting a rental property, pointing out outdated appliances and wasted space. Their tone was not of family visiting a parent, but of people evaluating an asset they intended to use. As the years passed, their involvement in my life increased, not in affection, but in control. Caroline would call to tell me what groceries to buy, reminding me of my medications as if I were a child. Mark insisted that certain repairs should be done, not because I asked for them, but because, as he put it, it will keep the resale value high. That word, resale, stabbed me every time, but I swallowed my pride, telling myself that maybe they were simply planning for the future. I gave them the benefit of the doubt because the alternative, that my own daughter considered me a burden standing between her and a profit, was too painful to accept. I do not pretend that I was always the easiest man to live with. Old age makes one slower, less tolerant of noise, more stubborn in habits. Perhaps I repeated the same stories too often. Perhaps I asked for help with things she thought I should still do alone. But does that justify the coldness with which she began to treat me? I remember once, during a family gathering, I offered to help her children with their school projects, eager to feel useful. My granddaughter rolled her eyes, whispering something about old-fashioned methods, and Caroline laughed instead of defending me. That laugh still echoes in my ears, because it told me that in her eyes I had already been demoted from father to relic, from a man to an embarrassment. The truth is, by the time the last winter came, I was already living in a state of half-exile inside my own house. Caroline and Mark visited only when they needed money, tuition, a car, repairs. And when I hesitated, they reminded me of all they had done for me, as if I owed them something for the years I had raised and fed and clothed them. I was still the legal owner of the place, though at the time I did not realize the details of the papers I had signed. They treated me as if the house was theirs, and I was tolerated only out of obligation. There is no loneliness like the loneliness of being unwanted in the place you created. Every night I would sit at the kitchen table, listening to the creak of the old walls, staring at the photographs of my wife that hung above the mantel, and asking myself the same question: how did I come to this? How did a life built on sacrifice and devotion end in silent contempt from my own child? I knew that one day something would happen that would push me completely out, but I never imagined the cruelty with which it would unfold. Still, even in those darkest evenings, when the cold seeped in through the windows and I felt as though I were already half a ghost, I clung to the belief that blood ties must count for something, that my daughter would remember not just the bricks of the house, but the hands that had built it, not just the inheritance, but the father who had once carried her on his shoulders. That hope, as fragile as it was, kept me from giving up entirely. What I did not know then was that the final act of betrayal was already approaching, and that I would soon find myself not only unwanted, but cast out, treated as if I were a stranger, an intruder in the very home where my life had unfolded. I did not know that I would be forced to sleep outside, like a beggar left at the mercy of the weather, while laughter and warmth filled the rooms that should have been mine. And yet, in that humiliation, in that freezing night under the stars, the seed of resistance was planted. The realization that if they had stripped me of family, they would not strip me of dignity. But before that turning point, before the anger that finally gave me strength, there was this long season of grief, of confusion, of watching my world shrink to the walls of a house that no longer welcomed me. That is the beginning of my story, the story of how an old man learned too late what betrayal looks like when it comes not from strangers, but from his own blood. It happened one evening in late November, the kind of evening when the wind outside cuts through the bare trees like knives, rattling the windows of the house and reminding you how fragile the warmth inside really is, and I had just settled into my armchair with a blanket across my knees, the old clock ticking in the hallway, when Caroline and Mark arrived unexpectedly. They did not come with smiles, or even the perfunctory questions about how I was feeling, but with the brisk air of people carrying out unpleasant business that could no longer be postponed. And I remember the way Mark dropped his coat on the back of the chair as if he already owned the place, his eyes scanning the living room like a surveyor. While Caroline stood with her hands folded, avoiding my gaze, I offered them tea out of habit because my wife would have insisted on hospitality even to those who did not deserve it. But they waved the offer away, and after a moment of awkward silence, Mark spoke with the bluntness of someone who believed his authority could not be questioned. "Leonard, this arrangement can't go on forever. It's too much for everyone, and we've decided something needs to change." The word arrangement struck me as strange, because I had never considered living in my own home to be an arrangement. But before I could ask what he meant, Caroline added in a voice that trembled with the effort of keeping it even, "Dad, you know we love you, but it's hard for us to manage everything. And you being here alone, in such a big place, it just doesn't make sense anymore. We thought maybe you could adjust." That word, adjust, was another knife, though delivered in a softer sheath. And I understood in that moment that they were not speaking about minor changes or compromises, but about me being removed, displaced, perhaps entirely cast out of the house. I tried to laugh, a brittle, uncertain laugh, and asked what exactly they had in mind, though deep down my stomach was already twisting with dread. Mark looked at me with the kind of detached pity that was worse than open contempt and said, "You could use the garage. It's spacious. We'll set up a heater, and that way the house can be more functional for us when we have people over or need the space." At first, I thought he was joking, some cruel test of patience, but Caroline nodded, her eyes flickering to the floor, and I realized they were perfectly serious. My own daughter was suggesting I give up my bedroom, my kitchen, my living room, the very heart of my home, and move into the garage like an old appliance, no longer useful, but not yet thrown away. I remember my voice breaking when I asked her if she truly believed that was a reasonable request, whether she thought her mother would have approved of her father being relegated to the cold concrete space where we used to store tools and bicycles. She sighed, exasperated as if I were being unreasonable, and said, "It's only temporary, Dad. You'll still have everything you need. And it's not like you're out on the street. We're trying to make it work for everyone," Mark added with a smirk. "Better than some people get in their old age. As though I should be grateful for their generosity in letting me stay on my own property." That night I could not sleep, my mind circling the words they had used, the tone of finality in their voices, and I felt a kind of despair I had never known, not even in the days after my wife's death. The house, which had always been my refuge, suddenly felt like enemy territory. Every creak of the floorboards a reminder that I was no longer welcome, that at any moment I might find my key not working in the lock. The next morning, as if to confirm my fears, I returned from a short walk to find the front door bolted from the inside, my key useless, and on the porch lay a plastic bag with some of my clothes folded neatly inside, as though I were a tenant being evicted without notice. I knocked once, twice, and eventually Caroline opened the door, just a crack, her face pale but resolute, and told me that it was better this way, that I could take what I needed and use the garage until we figured things out. The garage smelled of oil and dust, the cold seeping up from the concrete floor despite the thin rug they had thrown down, and in the corner stood a space heater that sputtered more than it warmed, its orange coil barely glowing against the chill. I sat on the old lawn chair, staring at the shadow of the house looming just beyond the thin wall. and I realized that I had crossed some invisible threshold. I was no longer considered the owner or even the elder to be respected, but a tolerated inconvenience. A beggar allowed to remain only because throwing me out completely might look bad to the neighbors. The humiliation burned deeper than the cold, and yet I told myself perhaps this was temporary. Perhaps if I endured it quietly, they would soften, remember who I was, and let me return. But in my heart, I knew the truth. They had already decided that my place was no longer at the center, but on the margins, and that once you are pushed to the margins, it is only a matter of time before you are pushed out altogether. What began as a single evening of cold discussion became the new order of life, each day bringing small confirmations of my exile. Caroline would bring me meals, not as a daughter bringing food to her father, but as a caretaker dropping off rations, placing them on the workbench without a word. And Mark would pass by, without acknowledgement, his car parked inches from my chair, as if daring me to object. At night I could hear them laughing inside, the clink of glasses, the warmth of a family dinner from which I was excluded, and I sat with my blanket pulled tight, staring at the dark rafters above me, wondering how many more nights I would be asked to live like this. The neighbors must have noticed, though no one said anything, perhaps believing the polite fiction Caroline spread, that I preferred the garage, that it was easier for me, that I wanted privacy. Lies are easy to swallow when the truth would force people to confront cruelty. The catalyst, then, was not a single moment, but a sequence of degradations, each one more absurd and more dehumanizing, until the line between father and intruder, between owner and squatter, blurred entirely. The day I found my key no longer fit the lock. The day my clothes were placed in a bag on the porch. The day my daughter told me with practiced calm that this is for the best. All of it fused into one truth. I had been expelled from my own life, reduced to an inconvenience to be managed rather than a man to be honored. It was the beginning of a descent I never imagined I would endure. And yet it was also the first flicker of anger, the first time I thought that if they could strip me of everything, I would need to find a way to strip them of their false sense of control. That thought was faint, almost drowned in grief, but it was there, waiting for the moment when humiliation would turn into resolve. The first nights in the garage were almost unbearable, not only because of the cold that seemed to crawl into my bones, no matter how many blankets I piled on myself, but because of the gnawing humiliation that accompanied every creak of the house. Next door, every muffled sound of laughter or clinking of dishes that reminded me that warmth and comfort were only a few feet away, yet forbidden to me, and I had to remain outside, like some unwanted guest lingering past his welcome. At first I convinced myself that this was temporary, that perhaps my daughter was overwhelmed or manipulated by her husband, and that eventually she would open the door and tell me to come back inside, that it had all been a mistake. But each passing day made it clear that this new arrangement was not a mistake, but a deliberate demotion, a calculated step to push me further from the life that had once been mine. On the third evening, after enduring a day of icy wind that swept through the cracks of the garage door and left me shivering despite the small heater sputtering weakly in the corner, I gathered the courage to knock on the kitchen window and asked Caroline if I could come inside just for dinner, not to intrude, but to sit with them at the table like a family. She looked at me through the glass, her face half in shadow, and after a pause she opened the door only enough to speak without letting me pass, saying softly but firmly, "Dad, it's easier if you eat in the garage. We have guests tonight, and it would just be awkward." I wanted to protest, to remind her that I was not some embarrassing stranger, but her father, the man who had once worked extra shifts to pay for her college who had driven through snowstorms to pick her up from rehearsals, who had stayed awake at night worrying about her future. But the words stuck in my throat, choked by the disbelief that she could look at me with so much calm while excluding me from the most basic human ritual of sharing a meal. I stepped back, nodding like a chastened child, and returned to the cold garage where a plate of reheated food awaited me on the workbench, left earlier without a word, like an offering to a pet. It was that night, sitting on the lawn chair with my blanket around my shoulders, that I first heard my grandchildren laughing about me, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they mocked the way, "Grandpa lives in the garage like a hermit," and though I wanted to believe they were just joking without malice, the fact that Caroline and Mark did nothing to correct them, even seemed to laugh along, cut me more deeply than any insult could have. I realized then that my exile was not only tolerated, but normalized. A story retold with humor until it became the truth. That I belonged in the garage, that I was no longer fit for the house, that my presence was something to be managed rather than cherished. That realization settled on me like frost, and though I tried to sleep, my mind kept circling the same thought. They had succeeded in turning me into an outsider in my own bloodline. The following week, the weather turned harsher, with freezing rain that seeped under the garage door and left puddles on the concrete, forcing me to curl up on the small cot they had finally dragged in for me, its mattress thin and damp at the edges. I asked Caroline if we could at least insulate the door better, afraid that I might fall ill. But she sighed impatiently and said, "Dad, we're doing the best we can. It's not easy for us either," as though my suffering was an inconvenience to her, something she resented having to acknowledge. Mark added coldly, "You've got a roof over your head, don't you? Plenty of folks your age are in nursing homes or worse. Be grateful." Be grateful. Those words echoed in my head long after they had gone inside, and I realized that gratitude was now expected of me for being allowed to remain on the property I had once built, as if my existence had been reduced to a debt I could never repay. The escalation did not stop there, for each day seemed to bring a new reminder of how far I had fallen in their eyes. When visitors came, Caroline would tell them casually that I preferred my space in the garage, painting me as eccentric rather than abandoned, and I could hear the forced laughter of those guests as they accepted the explanation without question. Once, when I dared to step into the house to use the bathroom while company was over, Mark intercepted me in the hallway and whispered harshly that I was embarrassing Caroline, that I should have waited until later, and he steered me back outside, like a servant caught trespassing. The humiliation of that moment seared into me, and I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the rafters, wondering how long before they decided even the garage was too much for me. But perhaps the deepest wound came the evening they hosted a dinner party, with music and bright lights spilling from the windows, while I sat outside in the dark, with the faint smell of their roasted meat drifting into the garage. At one point, I saw Caroline draw the curtains, not because the light bothered her, but because she did not want her friends to see me sitting there, a hunched figure wrapped in blankets, a reminder of the father she had hidden away. That act, small as it was, made me understand that I had become something shameful to her, an old burden to be concealed, and I knew then that no amount of patience or compliance would restore my place at her table. Still, for all the pain of those nights, something inside me began to shift. Humiliation, when repeated often enough, transforms into anger, and anger, when kept silent, begins to harden into resolve. I found myself remembering the papers I had signed years ago, the ones Caroline assured me were for convenience, and a faint spark of curiosity stirred in me. What exactly had I agreed to? And did I truly have no rights left? The thought was like a small flame in the darkness, fragile but alive, and I clung to it, even as the cold gnawed at me. I told myself that if they could treat me as a beggar, I would need to learn whether I still had any power left, however small, to remind them that I was not yet erased, not yet voiceless. And so the first escalation was not only in their cruelty, but in my awakening, in the painful realization that my exile was not an accident, but a strategy, and that if I did not resist, I would soon find myself pushed not only out of the house, but out of life itself, relegated to some institution or worse, forgotten altogether. The garage, with its smell of oil and its concrete floor, had become my prison. But it was also the place where I began to plot, to think, to remember that even in old age a man can still act, can still fight for the last shred of dignity. That night, as I listened to the rain hammering on the roof and the distant sound of laughter inside the house, I swore to myself that I would not remain a beggar at the gates of my own life forever. The breaking point came on a night that even now feels carved into my memory with the sharpness of ice. A night when the humiliation I had endured for weeks crystallized into something heavier, darker, something that stripped me of the last illusion. That I was still a father in the eyes of my daughter, and not merely a tolerated nuisance. It was early December, and the cold had settled in with a cruelty that no blanket could soften. The kind of cold that seeps into your marrow and makes you wonder whether you will wake at all in the morning. That evening Caroline and Mark had planned a gathering, friends and colleagues arriving in polished cars, their voices bright as they entered the house carrying bottles of wine and trays of food. And I had retreated to the garage, telling myself would be invisible, that if I stayed quiet I could at least preserve some fragment of dignity. But as the evening wore on, the laughter grew louder, spilling into the yard, and I realized, with a sick twist in my stomach, that they had locked the door leading into the garage, deliberately cutting me off not just from the warmth of the kitchen, but from even the possibility of stepping inside to use the bathroom or refill my water. I sat in my chair, listening to the music and the clinking of glasses, and for the first time in my life, I felt less like a human being and more like an unwanted animal, tethered outside, while the masters feasted indoors. At one point, I heard Caroline's voice, bright and clear above the din, saying to one of her guests that her father was doing fine in the garage, as if I had chosen this exile, as if this degradation was a lifestyle preference rather than a sentence imposed on me. The laughter that followed her words struck me harder than the wind against the door, and I knew then that my story was being rewritten in real time, turned into a joke, a cover narrative that allowed her to enjoy sympathy and admiration for her supposed generosity while I froze in silence. Hours later, when the party had reached its height, I ventured to knock softly on the door, not to intrude, but simply to ask if I might come inside for a little warmth. But the door remained locked, and when I pressed my ear against it, I could hear Mark's voice, low and irritated, telling Caroline, "Don't let him in. It will spoil the evening. He'll only embarrass us." Her reply, muffled but unmistakable, was, "It's better this way. He'll fall asleep soon. He always does." Those words, spoken with such casual finality, shattered whatever remnants of hope I had clung to. To them, I was not a father, not a man who had built their home and funded their lives, but an obstacle to be managed, an inconvenience to be minimized, a presence that could spoil their fun. I turned away from the door and stepped out into the yard, the cold wind cutting across my face, and I lowered myself onto the steps, wrapping my blanket tightly around me as the laughter inside continued, mocking me even without words. It was then, sitting outside my own house, while strangers drank and feasted at my daughter's table, that I made the vow that would change everything. I told myself that if I could survive this night, if I could endure the humiliation of being treated worse than a beggar, I would no longer accept the role they had written for me. I would find out exactly what rights I still had, what powers remained hidden in the papers I had signed, and I would use them not out of vengeance, but out of the sheer necessity of preserving the last fragment of self-respect I possessed. The thought gave me no comfort, but it gave me clarity, a sharp edge in the fog of despair. By the time the party ended and the lights inside the house dimmed, I was half numb with cold, my fingers stiff, my breath shallow, but my mind was awake in a way it had not been in years. I realized that my silence had allowed them to believe they could do anything without consequence, that my patience had been mistaken for weakness, and that the only way to reclaim even a shred of dignity was to stop waiting for kindness that would never come and to start asserting the rights they hoped I had forgotten. As I climbed back into the garage and lay down on the narrow cot, I whispered to myself a promise that sounded almost foreign on my tongue. No more begging, no more hoping, no more waiting at the door. If they could cast me out, I could cast them down, and the house that they treated as theirs alone might yet become the weapon of their undoing. That night was the midpoint of everything. The night when grief hardened into determination, when the scales tipped from endurance to defiance, and I understood with painful clarity that the battle for dignity had only just begun. In the days that followed that bitter December night, something within me had shifted, a quiet but irreversible change that made me see my daughter and her husband not as family, not even as caretakers or hosts, but as adversaries, as people whose intentions toward me were no longer ambiguous but openly hostile. And once that realization crystallized, there was no way to unsee the countless small signs I had overlooked for years. I began to notice how they spoke about me when they thought I could not hear. The way Caroline used the word responsibility when referring to me, as if I were a burden strapped to her shoulders rather than the man who had once carried her on his, back across icy sidewalks, and the way Mark's voice dripped with impatience whenever my name was mentioned, as though I were a stubborn debt that refused to vanish. Each overheard word was like another nail sealing me into the coffin of their plans, and I understood that what I had endured so far was not the end, but only the beginning of a campaign to erase me entirely from the life I had built. The first undeniable proof came when I discovered, quite by accident, that my bank card was missing. I had kept it in a small wooden box by my cot in the garage, hidden beneath some old photographs, and one morning when I reached for it, the card was gone. At first I thought I had misplaced it, but after searching every pocket, every drawer, even lifting the thin mattress from the cot, I knew it had been taken. My mind raced through possibilities, but the answer was as clear as it was painful. Caroline or Mark had entered while I was out walking, rummaged through my things, and taken the card, believing I would not notice, or that, if I did, I would be too confused to protest. That afternoon, Caroline came by with a forced smile, setting down a plate of food as though she were delivering rations to a prisoner. And when I asked her directly if she had seen my card, her face froze for a second too long before she shook her head and said, "You must have misplaced it, Dad. Maybe you dropped it somewhere. You forget things these days." That sentence, spoken with such casual cruelty, was a knife twisted slowly, because it revealed the second part of their plan. Not only were they stealing from me, they were preparing the narrative of my incompetence, painting me as forgetful, confused, no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I began to listen more carefully after that, feigning sleep when they passed by, and one night I heard them arguing in the kitchen. Mark's voice was low and angry. "We can't keep him around forever. He's becoming a liability. The neighbors will start asking questions." Caroline's reply was softer, but no less chilling. "Just a little longer, once we have the papers in order. Once the doctor signs off, we can apply for guardianship. Then everything will be under control." Guardianship, the word struck me like a thunderclap, because I understood its implications immediately. They were not content with pushing me into the garage, not satisfied with stealing bits of money from me. They wanted to declare me incompetent, to strip me of every legal right, to make me a ward of my own daughter, so that my life, my savings, my house would all be theirs to command. In that moment I knew that my fears had not been the paranoid imaginings of an old man, but a clear reading of their intentions, and I felt both terror and a strange kind of clarity. For once you name the enemy, you begin to see the battlefield. It was then that I remembered the old folder of documents I had stored in a locked drawer of my desk. Papers that Caroline had insisted were just technicalities, when she had me sign them after my wife's death. One morning while they were out, I slipped into the house with the spare key I had hidden years ago behind a loose brick in the garden wall, and I went straight to the study. My hands trembled as I unlocked the drawer and pulled out the folder, the smell of dust rising as I spread the pages across the desk. I expected to find proof of my surrender, evidence that I had foolishly signed away every claim to the house. But instead, my eyes widened as I read the legal language. I was not merely a co-signer, not a witness or a guarantor. According to the deed, I was a co-owner, my name written alongside Caroline's and Mark's, each of us holding equal shares. And moreover, the document contained a clause requiring unanimous consent for any sale or transfer of ownership. In that instant, the air seemed to thicken around me, because I realized I had been living as a beggar at the mercy of my daughter, while all along I had held the legal power to challenge them, to prevent them from claiming the house outright, even to initiate its sale myself if I chose. The discovery filled me with a surge of energy I had not felt in years, a kind of righteous fire that cut through the fog of humiliation. They thought me weak, thought me senile, thought me incapable of reading or understanding, and yet here was proof in black and white that I still held a weapon they had overlooked because they assumed I was too diminished to wield it. For days afterward I carried that folder back to the garage and kept it under my blanket at night, clutching it like a shield. And every time I heard their voices dismissing me, every time Caroline patted my hand with false sympathy and told me not to worry, I reminded myself that I held the truth, that I was not powerless, that the story they had written for me could still be rewritten. But the escalation of their cruelty did not pause. One morning I found my passport missing from the drawer where I had always kept it, and when I confronted Caroline, she told me with infuriating calm that she was safe keeping it, that she didn't want me to lose it the way I had lost my bank card, and she said this in the same voice she once used on her children when explaining why they could not have candy before dinner. I felt my hand shaking as I told her to return it, but she only smiled thinly and walked away. And I understood then that she no longer saw me as her father, but as a dependent, a patient, someone to be managed and contained until the legal machinery declared me officially incompetent. Later that week, I overheard her speaking on the phone, her voice low but urgent, telling someone, perhaps a lawyer, that the old man is slipping. He doesn't even remember where he puts things anymore. The paperwork should be straightforward. I see EKE'd, clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms. But I said nothing, for silence had become my mask, the disguise that allowed me to listen, to gather evidence, to prepare. The second escalation was not only their theft of my documents and their plotting behind closed doors, but also their attempts to rewrite my very identity. They began correcting me in front of others, telling neighbors that I was confused about dates, that I imagined conversations that never happened, and I saw the polite pity in the neighbors' eyes, the subtle nods that signaled they believed. Caroline's version. Once when I tried to join a conversation in the yard about the weather, Mark cut me off with a laugh and said, "Don't mind him. He gets things mixed up." and everyone chuckled as though it were harmless. But inside I felt the slow suffocation of being erased, of having my voice discounted before it even left my lips. This was their strategy, not just to isolate me physically in the garage, but to exile me socially, to destroy my credibility so that when the moment came to claim guardianship, no one would question it. And yet as the weight of their betrayal grew heavier, so too did my determination. Each insult, each theft, each lie was fuel for the fire that now burned steadily within me. I began to keep notes, writing down every conversation I overheard, every date when something was taken, every time Caroline or Mark treated me as though I were already incompetent. I hid these notes in the folds of my old coat alongside the deed, and each night before sleeping I reread them, reminding myself that I was not insane, that my memory was intact, that the narrative they were spinning was false. I began to imagine the day when I would walk into a lawyer's office and place the deed on his desk. The day when Caroline and Mark would be forced to see not the beggar they had created, but the co-owner they had underestimated. The escalation reached its peak one evening when Mark confronted me directly in the garage, his face twisted with irritation, and told me flatly that if I did not behave and accept the arrangement, they would have no choice but to move me into a care facility. The way he said care facility, with a curl of disdain on his lips, made it clear he was not speaking of a place of comfort, but of a warehouse for the unwanted, a place where old men go to be forgotten until they die. Caroline stood beside him, silent but complicit, her eyes refusing to meet mine. And in that moment I saw the future they envisioned for me, stripped of my home, stripped of my accounts, stripped of every shred of autonomy. Something inside me hardened then, a steel I did not know I still possessed, and I told myself with absolute clarity that I would rather die in that garage than let them bury me alive in a place of their choosing. And so the second escalation, while it was the darkest period of my humiliation, was also the furnace in which my resolve was forged. They had taken my card, my passport, my reputation, and yet they had overlooked the one thing that would undo them, the deed that still bore my name, the proof that I was not merely a guest or dependent, but a rightful owner. I began to plan in secret, my thoughts sharper than they had been in years, and for the first time since my wife's death, I felt something like purpose. They believed they were tightening the noose, but what they did not know was that each pull of the rope only pushed me closer to the moment when I would cut it free and leave them gasping in the trap they had set for me. I woke before dawn with the deed pressed flat beneath the quilt, like a talisman against the cold and the fear. And after washing my face in the garage sink and putting on the wool coat my wife had once mended at the elbow, I walked to the bus stop with a steadiness I had not felt in months, riding into town as the sky paled over the empty fields, and I stepped into a lawyer's office that smelled of paper and winter air and coffee, where a woman with a tired kindness in her eyes listened. Without interruption, as I laid the pages on her desk and spoke, not as a supplicant, but as a man who had finally remembered his name, she read the deed twice, her finger underlining each clause, and then she looked up with a calm that felt like a light switching on, explaining that I was not a guest, and not a dependent, and not a tolerated relic, but a co-owner was standing to act. That guardianship required evidence which my daughter did not have. That theft of documents was still theft even when done by family, and that the law, the slow as a winter river, could still move in my favor if I had the patience to let it. We spent the morning assembling the spine of my defense and the skeleton of my counterattack. She called my bank and helped me freeze the compromised accounts and issue new cards with a mailing address that was not the house. She drafted a letter demanding the immediate return of my passport on threat of a police report and attached an affidavit I signed with a hand that barely shook. She scheduled an appointment for a capacity evaluation with a geriatric specialist, not out of fear, but as a preemptive blow, so that when Caroline tried to put her story into the record, there would already be a record that contradicted it. And finally, when my breath had steadied, she slid across the card of a realtor she trusted and asked whether I wanted to keep living as a shadow at the edge of my own property, or whether I was ready to put the house in motion and let the ground shift under the feet of those who had mocked me. I told her I was ready. The realtor, Veronica Page, a brisk woman with snow in her hair and a habit of speaking plainly, met me at a coffee shop near the courthouse and treated me not like a fragile elder, but like a client with a clear objective. She drove past the house and did not flinch at the sight of my cot through the garage window or the neat planters my wife had once tended, now choked with dead vines. She measured the front yard with her eyes, studied the roof line and the siding, and said the market would respond quickly if the price was honest and the title clean, and that the only obstacle would be noise from the other owners, which we could drown out if we moved decisively. By late afternoon, she had a draft listing in her tablet and a list of photographers and a signpost scheduled for installation the following morning. My lawyer had already sent the required notices by certified mail to Caroline and Mark, informing them of my intention to market the property and reminding them of the unanimity clause, which I meant to test in court if they refused to engage. And I returned to the garage with a strange calm, the heater humming as if it were pleased to warm a man with a plan. The next day, while I was out for my medical evaluation, which the doctor conducted with meticulous courtesy, asking dates and names and sequences, checking the steadiness of my hands and the sharpness of my recall and the clarity of my judgment, and declaring in a tone that brooked no argument that I was fully capable of managing my own affairs, the sign went into the earth with a metal thunk that seemed to vibrate up the porch posts and into the bones of the house, a bright white rectangle with OST. My realtor's name and number printed in a confidence that felt like a bell tolling in daylight. When I returned that afternoon, the sign was standing there like a verdict, and the front curtains were trembling. And within minutes my daughter and her husband burst out onto the lawn with the ferocity of people who believe they have been ambushed. Mark shouted first, his face redder than the winter sun, accusing me of sabotage, of betrayal, of insanity. And Caroline stood beside him with the expression of a woman who has just realized that the portrait she painted of herself for the neighborhood will have to be repainted from scratch. They demanded I take the sign down. They said I would confuse the neighbors and ruin the holidays. They waved their arms and spoke about gratitude and family and the stress I was causing. And when I told them calmly that the notices had been delivered and the listing would proceed, that the courts were available if they wished to contest it, something flickered behind Caroline's eyes, a calculation shifting from contempt to fear. And then she played the card she had been shuffling for weeks, declaring in a trembling voice that I was forgetful, that I had lost bank cards and passports, that I wandered at night and could not tell one day from the next, and that she had no choice but to file for guardianship for my own good. I took the sealed envelope from my coat pocket, the ink still fresh from the doctor's signature, and I handed it to her as one might hand back a lie that had been carelessly dropped, telling her she could include it with her petition. And for second, the wind seemed to stop, and the yard fell quiet except for the creak of the signpost, and Mark took a step toward me and said something low and ugly under his breath. But before he could finish the sentence, Veronica's car rolled up, and my lawyer, who had decided to stop by on her way to another hearing, stepped out with the quiet authority of someone who knows which side of the law is load-bearing. She greeted them politely and explained in a voice that clipped the edges off their bluster that any attempt to remove the sign would be treated as interference with a lawful sale effort, that any attempt to withhold my passport would be reported as theft, and that any petition alleging incompetence should be filed promptly so that it could be dismissed promptly, because the court's time, like mine, was valuable. Caroline stared at her shoes. Mark sputtered something about our home, and my lawyer nodded gravely and said that shared ownership made it everybody's home and nobody's castle, and that the fairest path, given the level of conflict, the overlapping equities, and the condition of the relationship, was a partition by sale, which a judge would be reluctant to deny. They retreated indoors and slammed the door, and for the first time in months I stood on that lawn without wanting to curl in on myself, because the house itself seemed to acknowledge that the balance had shifted. 2 days later, paperwork moved with the kind of speed that happens when people who have been quietly preparing finally pull the pin. Caroline filed her guardianship petition with a stack of unsigned doctor's notes and neighbor gossip, and we filed our response with the evaluation. The bank affidavits showing suspicious withdrawals attempted from my card during the period it went missing, the notarized demand letter regarding the passport, and a short declaration in my own hand describing the arrangement in the garage, not as melodrama, but as plain fact. The hearing took place in a courtroom whose windows let in winter light like cold water, and when the judge asked me to speak, I told him about the morning coffee I still brewed the way my wife taught me, about the photographs packed in the top dresser drawer, about the lawn chair beside the sputtering heater, about the nights when laughter in my dining room drowned out the sound of my name, and I told him that I was not asking the state to fix a family, only to recognize that I was still totes person under the law, entitled to keep my documents, to control my accounts, to sit at my own table, or sell my own share when the table was taken from me. Caroline cried then, not with the tears of a daughter, but with the theatrics of someone staring down an audience, and Mark tried to speak over my lawyer until the judge shut him down with a look that would have made a harder man sit. And when the E and O's ruling came, it arrived with a clarity that felt like thaw. Petition denied for lack of evidence, status quo preserved, passport to be returned forthwith, and the parties strongly encouraged to resolve the property dispute by agreement, failing which, the court would entertain a motion to order sale and division in the interests of equity and peace. The gavel fell, the clerk scribbled, and I felt the strange sensation of my legs needing to learn how to carry me again, as if they had forgotten that they were allowed to walk out of a room with something other than shame. The drive back to the house was quiet. Veronica took the long way so I could look at the city without flinching, and when we turned onto my street, the sign was still planted, and the lawn looked newly raked, as if someone had tried to clean the story at the edges, and we found the front door open. My passport on the hall table, like a surrendered weapon. Caroline appeared at the top of the stairs, with the strange stiffness of a person who has rehearsed a speech and knows it will not land. And she told me in a voice that tried for dignity and found only fatigue that the neighborhood was watching, that I was destroying everything, that I would die alone if I kept this up. I told her quietly that I had been alone for a long time, and that I would no longer let that loneliness be weaponized against me. Mark came down the stairs with a box in his arms, shouldered past me as if I were fog, and slammed out the door. Veronica measured the silence with a realtor's ear and said the photographs would be done by sunset and the listing live by the weekend. That evening, an offer came in above, asking, clean and quick, from buyers who loved the old woodwork and the deep porch and did not care about the ghosts. The counter-offer was drafted while the last of the daylight pooled under the eaves, and my lawyer prepared a motion for partition and sale to land on the judge's desk Monday morning in case my co-owners refused to sign, which of course they did, because pride is louder than arithmetic until a court makes it do the math. The climax was not shouting in a driveway or a door slammed on my face, although there had been plenty of both. The climax was the judge's brief denial, the notarized return of my passport, the white sign creaking slightly in a winter gust while strangers admired the bay window my wife had polished every spring. The realization that a man others had exiled to a garage could, by standing up straight and speaking clearly, move the immovable thing that anchored their lives. I slept that night in the garage one last time, not because I had to, but because I wanted to mark the end of it. The heater finally warm enough, the deed tucked back into its folder. The smell of cardboard and motor oil no longer the smell of a cell, but of a place I had outgrown. And in the spaces between the radiator's ticks, I let the anger drain out, until what remained was something quieter and harder and better suited to an old man who had chosen dignity over sentiment. In the morning, the photographer asked me to step out of the frame while he captured the light on the stairwell, and I did, smiling a little at the peculiar courtesy of being asked to leave the picture of a house I was finally managing to leave on my own terms. And when Veronica shook my hand on the porch, she squeezed it, not like a broker who had won a commission, but like a woman who had watched a fellow human reclaim the simple right to decide where he would sit when the evening came. When the sale was finalized and the proceeds divided under the court's order, I stepped out of that house for the last time, carrying nothing but a suitcase of clothes, the folder of documents, and a photograph of my wife that had always stood on the mantel. And though my daughter wept and called me cruel and accused me of destroying her life, I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself, because I had learned that explanations were wasted on those who saw you only as a means to their comfort. I walked away, not in triumph, but in a strange stillness, as though the years of humiliation had settled into sediment at the bottom of me, heavy but unmoving, and above it the surface was finally clear. I rented a modest apartment in a quiet complex on the edge of town, where most of the residents were my age, people who had already lost spouses or houses or children to time and change, and they welcomed me without suspicion or pretense, inviting me to their evening card games and Sunday coffee gatherings as if I had always been there. For the first time in years, I sat at a table where my presence was not a burden but a given, and the simple kindness of being asked whether I took sugar in my tea felt like a small resurrection. Caroline and Mark, I later heard through neighbors, had to downsize to a smaller house farther out, the kind without the wide porch or the finished basement, and the bitterness of that loss spread through their marriage like rot, each blaming the other for underestimating me. And though part of me ached at the thought of my daughter living in anger, another part reminded me that she had chosen her side when she laughed at me through the window. The grandchildren did not call, and perhaps they never will, but I no longer wait by the phone, because I have come to understand that family is not simply the people bound to you by blood, but those who look you in the eye and see you as whole. Some evenings I walk through the park with my cane tapping the path, and I think of the nights in the garage when I believed I had been erased, when I mistook silence for defeat, and I tell myself that even in old age a man can carve out one last act of defiance, that dignity is not granted by children or neighbors or courts, but by the decision to stand when others expect you to kneel. I do not pretend that I am happy all the time. The nights are still long, and the bed is still cold without my wife beside me. But the difference is that now the loneliness is honest, not imposed by cruelty or by exile. And in that honesty there is a kind of peace. I keep the deed, though it no longer binds me to walls or roof, as a reminder that even paper can carry the weight of justice if one has the patience to read it. And I sometimes take it out late at night and run my fingers over my name printed. There, proof that I had not been as powerless as they wanted me to believe. In those moments I feel not revenge, but a quiet satisfaction. The knowledge that my story did not end in the garage with the heater sputtering, but in a courtroom and a closing office, where my voice still carried enough weight to be heard. And so the resolution of my life is not that I won or that they lost, but that I walked through humiliation into clarity, through silence into speech, through exile into a place of my own choosing. The house is gone. The family I raised has turned into strangers. But I remain, and I remain standing. And sometimes that is all a man can ask of himself at the end, to remain.